Imagine living in a home carved right into a cliff face. Well, between about 600 and 1300 CE, that's exactly what people did in the American Southwest. The Ancestral Pueblo people, also called the Anasazi, built impressive stone dwellings along the cliffs of canyons in what is now Colorado, Utah, and New Mexico. And we're going to explore one of their most famous settlements right here, Mesa Verde. Mesa Verde means green table in Spanish. And when conquistadors first came across this place in the 1500s, they saw these amazing structures built right into the sides of these big sandstone cliffs. But people had been living here for 900 years before the conquistadors arrived. And it's just one of the many places where the Ancestral Puebloans built similar homes. This civilization thrived in an area we today call the Four Corners because it sits at the intersection of what are now Colorado, Utah, Arizona, and New Mexico. And they built in other places like Chaco Canyon and dozens more. And to learn about them, archaeologists have excavated over 40 sites. But why did they build their houses like this? Well, building a house out of stone is pretty labor-intensive, so people didn't start doing it here until around 600 CE. And by then, the Ancestral Puebloans weren't some peaceful farmers. No, they'd already developed into a complex society with independent city-states, and they were looking for ways to protect themselves from their neighbors. And they probably got the idea from watching the animals around them. See, Mesa Verde has these natural alcoves formed by the way the rain and wind eroded the soft sandstone over time, and the Ancestral Puebloans thought, hey, that looks pretty safe. So they started building multi-story apartment complexes into these alcoves, using mud mortar to hold up huge flat stones. It wasn't easy work. These buildings might have looked like adobe or brick to the conquistadors, but each rock monolith took dozens of people to move into place. Then they filled the gaps between the rocks with clay and rubble to make a thick wall that was thick enough to protect the residents from both their enemies and the harsh weather. And those enemies included the Ancestral Puebloans' neighbors, the ancestral Apaches and the Utes who lived further south and west. Now, not all cliff dwellers were pacifists, and there is evidence that they fought back against those who attacked them. For example, archaeologists found projectile points embedded in the walls of the cliff dwellings. Now, living in these cliff homes was not without its challenges. They didn't have running water, so they had to collect rainwater in storage containers, and they needed to haul out the waste, animal and human, from the bottom of the cliff. But overall, it was a pretty safe place to live. Between the thick stone walls and the fact that you had to climb down a ladder to get inside, the residents of Mesa Verde were pretty safe from their enemies, and that made it easier for them to focus on farming in this otherwise pretty hostile environment. The Ancestral Puebloans farmed along the river valleys in this region, growing corn, beans and squash, which all grow well even in dry desert land. But that's not easy to do when your fields are constantly being flooded. So the Ancestral Puebloans used irrigation ditches to redirect water onto their crops and away from their homes. To build their farms, they dammed the rivers to create reservoirs, and they dug canals that brought water to their fields. And when the rivers overflowed their banks, the excess water would flow through these canals and onto the farms. Then, once the farms were watered, the water continued flowing downstream. And this was pretty complicated engineering for ancient people, and it was necessary to feed their growing population. At its peak, Mesa Verde was home to about 5,000 people. That's a lot of people to feed in an environment that can be pretty unforgiving, so the Ancestral Puebloans had to maximize every available resource, including, yes, even the poop. The ancestors of the modern Pueblo peoples practiced something called Three Sisters farming, which is a form of companion planting where they planted corn, beans and squash together. The corn stalks provided a framework for the beans to climb on, and the beans added nitrogen to the soil, which nourished the corn and the squash. And animal dung made a great fertilizer. In fact, archaeologists found animal bones in areas near the trash piles, which suggested the Ancestral Puebloans raised animals nearby, butchered them, and then composted their poop. Now, Mesa Verde was just one of many Ancestral Pueblo settlements, but it wasn't alone. There were other large communities all across the region, including one in Chaco Canyon, New Mexico. Chaco Canyon looks like a bad hair day for the earth. All these long straight lines are actually roads that connected the community of Chaco Canyon with other settlements as far away as Mesa Verde and the Hopi Pueblos. The community in Chaco Canyon was a hub for trade and cultural activity, kind of like a teenager's bedroom floor after a party. It was messy, but everything eventually found its way back to it. See, Chaco Canyon had these enormous apartment complexes built out of logs and adobe that could house hundreds of people. And they had astronomers who kept track of the planets and stars. So people from miles around came to Chaco Canyon to buy things, to visit the astronomers, and maybe even to party. In fact, the total population of Chaco Canyon probably peaked at about 2,000 people. And during the day, when everyone was awake, the streets would be bustling with vendors, tourists, astronomers, and more. But why did the Ancestral Puebloans need astronomers? Well, this is where things get kind of weird. You see, the Ancestral Puebloans were closely tied to their agricultural lifestyle. And when the temperatures shifted just a few degrees, that could mean the difference between a bountiful harvest and starvation. Plus, they didn't have a written language, so they needed some other way to keep track of time. So they turned to the sky. The Ancestral Puebloans aligned some of their buildings to the cardinal directions and the rising and setting sun, and they used the stars to help them predict when it was time to plant or harvest their crops. In fact, some scholars think they even identified comets, and since Chaco Canyon was such a cultural hub, its astronomers were especially influential. The Ancestral Puebloans in Chaco Canyon observed the cycles of the heavens and shared their knowledge with other communities for hundreds of miles around. So if you wanted to know when it was time to harvest, you might travel to Chaco Canyon to consult their astronomers. But they weren't cheap. For their services, they charged the equivalent of about a week's worth of food per consultation. But all good things must come to an end. Starting in the late 1200s, the Ancestral Puebloans began abandoning their cliff dwellings. Now, archaeologists aren't totally sure why they left. Maybe it was the increasing dryness in the region, or maybe it was pressure from neighboring groups, or maybe it was both. All we know is that around 1300 CE, drought and dwindling resources forced many Ancestral Puebloans to abandon their homes and flee. Now, some scholars believe that the Ancestral Puebloans simply moved away from these cliff dwellings and into the more densely populated regions of what we today call New Mexico and Arizona. There they became the Pueblo tribes who still live there today. But other scholars believe that the Ancestral Puebloans were completely wiped out by their neighbors, and there's evidence to support both theories. For example, there are settlements in New Mexico that show clear cultural connections to those in Chaco Canyon and Mesa Verde. And the Zuni and Hopi tribes in New Mexico both claim the Ancestral Puebloans as their ancestors. On the other hand, we also find skeletal remains that show signs of violence that may have occurred during the late 1200s when the Ancestral Puebloans were fleeing. Ultimately, we don't know what happened to them. But one thing is clear: the Ancestral Puebloans lived vibrantly for over 900 years. They developed incredible farming techniques and built homes that were unlike any others. They didn't leave behind any huge pyramids or palaces, but they did leave behind a legacy that inspires awe in anyone who explores their cliff dwellings today. So thanks for watching.